unfinished business. And they've done great the past few years, even set a few records, but he doesn't really care about that. Here's one of the records they set. First team ever with 40 passing touchdowns and 20 rushing touchdowns, 4,000 passing yards, and 3,000 or more rushing yards. So, Brew, have the Ravens done enough? They haven't done much this offseason to impress you.
Yeah, I mean, basically all they did was add DeAndre Hopkins. I mean, they kept Stanley, which is great. Hopkins, I think we saw what he did in Kansas City. I think he can help Zay Flowers. You heard a lot about he was great in the wide receiver room. He can help Bateman, those guys, become better. But the problem for the Ravens was not on the field. It was in here.
Wow.
I'm serious.
Yeah.
I mean, it's too many penalties, unforced errors. Lamar fumbling, when he didn't turn the ball over all year. And Mark Andrews dropping the. So they just have to continue to mature, which I thought they did last year. Lamar, obviously, despite the fumble and the turnovers in the AFC Championship game, did overcome some barriers that he hadn't before. The defense got better throughout the season. They actually cut down the penalties late in the year, too. So they just have to mature to the point where they can play their best football when it's needed in the playoffs. I think on paper they're as good as anyone. And can win the Super Bowl with what they have if they play their best when it's time to play your best.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So when you look at the continuity, they have a lot more continuity than they did last year. So they did lose one offensive lineman, but remember last year they were shuffling 3 offensive linemen around. They lost their offensive line coach during training camp, which is a hard thing to overcome. A new defensive coordinator last year. He's now in his second year. So that's all really positive in the sense that they're not reshuffling the deck in really any one area. So they are uniquely starting kind of where they left off, which is huge. And your point about Lamar getting over that Pittsburgh hurdle, right, I think was significant. And the thing that the Ravens have always done really well is draft. So they still have the draft to look forward to and a chance to really improve some of those areas that may have been a little bit more of a weakness last year.
So listen, DeAndre kind of runs his own routes. I actually think he'll be far more successful with Baltimore than with Kansas City because so many of Lamar's best plays are he's escaped, he's looking, and guys are freelancing a bit. I think
although Mahomes does that too.
But that's not really the role he had there, and he ended up not being on the field because he wasn't really running the right routes. You saw DeAndre succeed like that. He was younger and a better player at that point, but with Kyler on similar stuff. So I do like that. Here's the thing with Baltimore. They have to be the 1 seed. We've never seen them play 2 really good playoff games. If you're not the 1 seed, you're going to have to play 3 to get to the Super Bowl. So, I think that the path they had a couple of years ago. Right, I understand. But
all right. To put that on the Ravens right now in March, I mean, all right, can we just, can we take a breather here? Listen, the Ravens, this whole, have they closed the gap, right? It all depends on how you want to look at it. I made a previous Ravens video talking about, kind of what do they need to do. Does DeAndre Hopkins close, did it make them have a step forward? Because I don't even see it as a gap. It's did you take a step forward? And we kind of talked about, and I talked a lot about that. And a lot of people in the comment section, rightfully so, are kind of they don't need players necessarily to take that step forward. They're already kind of, good enough, or the roster is good enough there. And it's right. And then the problem is coaching. Brew's oh, the problem is up here. No, it's coaching and that aspect. And so if you're not going to improve the coaching, well, then you need to improve the roster, or the existing players need to just continue to grow and evolve and be even better. Like Zay Flowers. I mean, Lamar Jackson, there's only so much better that he's going to be able to get, Derrick Henry's not going to be able to get better at this point of his career. And you can make the argument there's, a couple other players on the Ravens that still have room to actually legitimately improve. But the Ravens, oftentimes it wasn't just mental mistakes. It was lack of preparation. And even the game against the Bills, yeah, it obviously wasn't a perfect game. There was still questionable coaching decisions, questionable play calling. Like, so that's not a mental mistake. Yes, did Andrews drop the ball? Did Lamar fumble? Yes, all of those things can be true, but it doesn't excuse away the coaching. I really don't understand with the Baltimore Ravens why you have other teams. Shanahan, who dealt with a decimated, team from injuries, both offensive and defensively, with a quarterback who people don't even think is that good, depending on who you ask, Brock Purdy. He got ridiculed for not being a good enough coach last year, or even in the Super Bowl, etc., etc. And yet, this whole offseason, and especially post-playoffs, I don't hear anyone call out the coaching staff for the Baltimore Ravens. I don't understand it. I really, 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 really don't. The Philadelphia Eagles, even as they're winning, got, Sirianni getting ripped, and Kellen Moore, they questioned Kellen Moore's play calling when they beat the Rams, and what are you doing? Why are you calling this play with Jalen Hurts when he has a bad knee? Like, whatever. I don't, and they won the Super Bowl. They literally won the Super Bowl. And yet there's just no actual aftermath criticism of the coaching staff for the Baltimore Ravens. And so that's what's always confusing. That's what makes kind of talking about the Ravens, because I realized this, because I talked about the Ravens, because I've been banging on the coaching drum for a while now, with the Baltimore Ravens. And then I made a video, because then there was a specific video of about DeAndre Hopkins, and it's like, what does this do for the Ravens? And I was like, oh, it's not enough. It's not enough for them to really take that big step forward. But then I realized that when you're looking at the Ravens in isolation, like an individual, like, let's just look at this move, DeAndre Hopkins, will this make a difference? And you're just like, it can and it can't. Because if you're not really getting to a source problem, well, then it's not going to make a big enough difference unless you add a player who can really overcome any of these other limitations. Or any of the other issues that kind of seem to unfold throughout a Baltimore Ravens season. So yes, if I think this team was more prepared and ready to go, yeah, they should have won. But someone in the comment section kind of said, oh, DeAndre Hopkins can turn more field goals into touchdowns. And it's just like, that's such a limited way of kind of looking at it, because you wouldn't have necessarily said that was a problem for the Baltimore Ravens. That's not why they didn't win the Super Bowl this year, okay? Because they should have been able to score the amount of touchdowns that they needed to beat the Raiders, to beat the Browns. They should have been able to have the 1 seed this year, okay? That's kind of what it gets boiled down to. And especially if you want to look at execution, it wasn't like, oh, they kicked a field goal when they could have scored a touchdown against the Kansas City Chiefs in Week 1 or against the Bills in the playoffs. Like, that's not where those things kind of went wrong for them. And just because you add DeAndre Hopkins, if we're still kind of dealing with a source problem, adding a player like a DeAndre Hopkins doesn't magically change that. Actually, like, it doesn't really make sense. So, I think a team like the Ravens will be tough to evaluate in the offseason, because it's not so much of like their players. It's more, how do we expect these players to play? And will there finally be a step forward in terms of just how this team is ready to play in any given moment? Like, that's what it gets. We can just look at the Eagles again, and we can also look at the Chiefs. The Eagles were fundamentally ready to play against the Commanders, against the Chiefs in the Super Bowl. The Chiefs were ready to go against the Bills in the playoffs. The Bills were not. The Ravens against the Bills, they were not. They were against the Steelers, but they weren't against the Bills. And although I still defend that game and say, Lamar Jackson was leading them back, and, and he's allowed to make mistakes, just like we saw Patrick Mahomes fumble against the Bills and lose the ball. Like, those things can still happen, but everyone else was ready to play, was ready to go. The execution was there. Spags dialed up a perfect play against Josh Allen and the Buffalo Bills offense, on the final play of the game. He did everything to make it difficult for the Bills. That's what the Kansas City Chiefs did against the Bills. The Ravens did not do that for the Bills. They did not do everything they could to make everything more difficult for the Bills. In fact, the Ravens made things more difficult for themselves. That's part of the problem right then and there. So the question is not, have the Ravens done enough to close the gap? The question is, what do the Ravens need to do to play higher quality football throughout the entire season, especially in the playoffs? And again, that comes down to coaching. But people, for some reason, they only ever want to talk about coaching when it feels like it's like a controversy. Harbaugh's not controversial. He's actually reportedly like an awesome person, a great person, a positive person. He's not yelling and barking. He's not being snarky in the media. Like he's not someone who's kind of, inflammatory in that regard. Sirianni's barking at fans, shaving his head. He's young, hasn't won a Super Bowl. So people are like, yeah, man, let's highlight this guy. Let's rip him apart. Let's do that. Harbaugh seems to kind of just be grandfathered in, and even the coordinators. Because like I said, Kellen Moore legitimately got more criticisms, and Fangio for that matter, throughout last season for the Philadelphia Eagles, and yet they had one of the best offenses, one of the best defenses, and dominant win in the NFC Championship game and Super Bowl. And yet when you reflect back, you could see that all those coaches got more criticism, and quite frankly, even the players like a Jalen Hurts, A.J. Brown, etc. Compare that to the Baltimore Ravens, and you're like, we didn't really get a lot of the criticism. There were some questions what's wrong with the Ravens when they kind of, when they did drop a game or so, but especially once they lost in the playoffs, there to this day, there was still more criticism on the Philadelphia Eagles who won the Super Bowl. That's not holding your team accountable. That's not actually doing, a legitimate inventory of like what went right, what went wrong here. Because this team should have been better. And this is what I said in my previous Ravens video. You had Tom Brady saying, this Baltimore Ravens team is a sleeping giant. Well, then the question is, there's two questions. One, why were they ever sleeping in the first place? And two, why did they not wake up? There has to be an answer. And unfortunately, even I fell prey to this. Adding like a DeAndre Hopkins, and even seeing a question like this, did the Ravens do enough to close the gap? It ends up being the shell game. You end up being like, you end up start having the wrong conversation, because the Ravens were not a DeAndre Hopkins away from winning the Super Bowl, because that was not the core of their problem, especially when you had the high-powered offense that they did. Doesn't add up there. But you can be a DeAndre Hopkins away if you're trying to overcome bad coaching. But I'd argue that DeAndre Hopkins is no longer that level of a player that now allows that to even be a thing. So I don't know. We will see. Yeah, something has to change with this team. Something. And if they come up short again, how you can just kind of keep running it back in that regard. Because someone in the comment section, they commented on an older Ravens video. And they said, the problem with the Ravens is they constantly need new coaching, and so they always need like new schemes and this, that. And it's like, that's nonsense. That's just absolute nonsense. Again, the Philadelphia Eagles had new coordinators in 20. They had a new set of coordinators in 22, went to the Super Bowl, lost those coordinators, and had two brand new coordinators, and then won the Super Bowl. From 2018 to 22, new head coach, new coordinators, new quarterback, new everything except for like 4 or 5 players that are like really just kind of big body players, like a Lane Johnson, and a field goal kicker, and there you go. So don't tell me that the problem is that, no. Again, it's another cop out. Hire the right coaches at the right time. Move on from a head coach. The Ravens don't have the excuses anymore. You can't say, well, what about this? But no. If you want to maybe defend a Lamar Jackson, I'm more open to that. But the organization itself, no. No. I've defended Lamar, and I've defended, because of coaching and this, that, and the third. But the franchise itself does not deserve any excuse. There's no excuses. The Philadelphia Eagles put that on full display when they absolutely dominated the Kansas City Chiefs. Zero excuses. Zero. That they were able to do, what the Eagles were able to do to the Kansas City Chiefs in the Super Bowl, something that the Bills were unable to do, the Ravens were able to do throughout their entire time of this run of the Kansas City Chiefs, the Bills, and the Ravens run, and the Bengals for that matter. So, the franchises are out of excuses. The quarterbacks still have excuses because of the franchises that they play for. The franchise, absolutely not. And every time you do that, every time you let them off the hook, don't do that. But those are just my thoughts. I'd absolutely love to hear yours. What do you guys all think about the Baltimore Ravens? Have they done enough to close the gap? I'll just say this real fast too. I wish I kind of opened this with this more, because I do think that using the Philadelphia Eagles are such a fascinating reference point. When you look at the Eagles and how they won 2 Super Bowls, essentially in it's not the exact timeline, but essentially you have Josh Allen, Joe Burrow, and Lamar Jackson. And you had the Philadelphia Eagles essentially win 2 Super Bowls, go to 3 Super Bowls during this relative timeline of these players. Again, it's not an exact, matchup, but within this relative timeline, beating great teams, beating the Patriots and beating the Kansas City Chiefs with quarterbacks who are supposed to be inferior, right? No one's going to say that Nick Foles is better than Lamar, and no one's saying that Lamar Jackson, that Jalen Hurts is better than Lamar Jackson, and supposed to be inferior coaching. Harbaugh's supposed to be a better coach than Sirianni, better than Doug Peterson. Doug Peterson doesn't even have a job right now, at least not to my knowledge. So you got to ask yourself, how does that happen? Like you're supposed to have a better coach, a better quarterback. And it's not luck. It's not by luck. It's not like, well, we have to pay the Chiefs. They don't. They beat the Chiefs. Well, we have to pay. They beat the Patriots. They beat Tom Brady, who then went on. Tom Brady was still so good that he then went on to win multiple Super Bowls after that, including Bill Belichick. So that's what I'm trying to say. There's no actual excuses. And it wasn't because the Eagles found themselves in this amazing situation where they were able to draft this unbelievable. They did it with different coaching staffs and different quarterbacks. Because the source of the shortcomings of a team like the Ravens is the franchise itself. And acknowledging that is so important. The fact that this Ravens franchise is even remotely okay, constantly running it back with very similar cast and characters, doesn't make sense to me. But those are just my thoughts. I'd absolutely love to hear yours. What do you guys all think about the Baltimore Ravens? Do you think they've done enough to close the gap? Does the gap even exist? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single comment, so whether you agree with me or disagree with me, either way, let's get in some discussions. Let's get in some fights. But ultimately, let's just have some fun. And please do consider subscribing. We're building an amazing community here, and I absolutely love to see you part of it. I want to build something that we all genuinely feel connected to. Something that we're really excited to be part of. I think we're on our way to doing it. Please don't forget to give this video a thumbs up, as it really does help the visibility and the algorithm. Thank you so much. See you next time.